Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to another Hobby Hour tutorial. Let's talk about highlighting and shading in the Games Workshop Eavy Metal style. I'm going to demonstrate how to highlight two different materials, the armor with its exaggerated hard edge highlights and the cloth with softer and more blended highlights. We'll cover a few different techniques that are great to have in your toolbox for future painting projects. I'll be using a few different brushes here. An older brush with a blunt tip for the base coats, another brush with a slightly finer tip for soft glazes, and a couple brushes that are new with very fine tips for the precise work. Before we can begin highlighting and shading, we need a smooth, solid base coat. An airbrush would be the best, but I want to try and show that you don't need an airbrush to get good results. I'm using Macragge blue and I've thinned it slightly with water. Thick paint will clog up the details, so you need to thin it down. The more you thin the paint, the smoother the finish will be, so it will end up taking multiple layers to achieve a solid color. You want to make sure it's not too thin though, because the thinner the paint, the more likely it is to run. So we want to make sure that the brush isn't too overloaded with paint. Let's take a look down at my palette. When I gather paint on the brush, I'll wipe it off a little bit. If you rotate the brush as you pull it along your palette, it will form the hair into a point. Alternatively, if you pull the brush without rotating it, you'll form the hair into a chisel shape. Here's an example of paint that's too thin. The paint runs right off the surface and into the cracks, and it flows everywhere. Here's an example of too much paint on the model. The paint is thinned appropriately, but the brush is overloaded, and all the detail is obscured. Here's the armor after one coat of paint. Notice how it's fairly even, but the gray primer is still showing through, so it will need another coat. Everything has been base coated and it's looking smooth and even, so now we can start shading and highlighting. I like to start with shading, and the first thing I'm going to do is what I call a soft shade. By soft I mean a blended, subtle shift in value, as opposed to a sharp transition like an edge highlight. You'll want to pick a color that's only slightly darker than your base coat. I'm using Kantor blue for this step, thinned heavily with water. Remember that the thinner the paint gets, the less you want on your brush. I want to create some subtle shading on roughly the bottom third of each armor panel. With barely any paint on the brush, apply a thin layer. It shouldn't flow at all and it should stay right where you put it, and the layer should be thin enough that it dries pretty fast. This kind of shading will take a while to build up, so go slowly and concentrate more of the layers near the bottom, which should result in a smooth blend. With all the soft shading applied, it's time to add some hard shading in the form of panel lining. I'm using a mix of black and Kantor blue thinned with some water. With a very fine brush, gather some paint, then drag the brush along your palette while rotating it. This will help form the hair into a fine point. Paint this mix into all the cracks and lines between the armor panels. Just like with the last layer we did, I want the paint to stay exactly where I put it and not to flow away. After all the panel shading is done, I'm going to do a soft highlight on roughly the top third of each armor panel. I want a color that's slightly lighter than my base coat, so I'm using a mix of Macragge blue and Calgar blue. Thin the paint down heavily, and just like what we did with the shading, apply some glazes with very little paint on the brush. The layers should be so thin it dries almost as soon as it comes off the brush. Keep building up layers and focus the next layers closer to the top. The more you practice, the smoother you'll be able to get the blend. With all the soft highlights done, it's time to start edge highlights. I'm going to switch to a finer tipped brush and use Calgar blue thinned slightly with water. Remember to rotate the brush as you drag it to help form a point. The first highlight will be the widest one. Some people call this the chunky highlight. It can be as wide as you like, but a good rule of thumb is to take the thinnest line you can paint and double it. Calgar blue is a fairly transparent color, so it will take a couple layers before it gets to its full strength. We can use this to our advantage by painting a second layer on top of the first. Now there's a slightly lighter line a little closer to the edge, so we're effectively getting two highlights out of one color. For the next highlight, I mixed some white into the Calgar blue, about 2 parts blue to 1 part white. The Games Workshop paint guides often suggest Fenrisian gray on ultramarines, but I think it's a little too gray for my taste. I like the brighter blue color I get from mixing. This highlight will go on nearly all the edges of the armor, but I feel it's important to vary the width of the line slightly based on where the light is coming from. For the most part, that means the top-facing edges will have a wider highlight, and the bottom edges will have a more narrow line. This all comes down to personal taste though, so it's up to you. At this stage I feel I need to stress just how important good quality brushes are when painting this level of detail. Good sable or Kolinsky sable brushes are ideal. There are a few different brands out there and they all work well. Just make sure it holds a very fine point. For the final highlight on the armor, I added some more white into the Calgar blue. This is about 3 parts white to 1 part blue, thinned with about equal parts water. I want these highlights to be on the topmost sections and corners only. When I paint the last highlights on, I like to have the lines tapered and fade out, rather than stop abruptly or make dots. I feel it ends up looking more natural. Some painters like to add a spot highlight in some areas, such as the knees and shoulder pads. You can do this with some of the same techniques as the soft highlight. Once that first layer is dry, you can build up a few more layers until it's as bright as you want. I think it's easy to overdo these, so I'd advise making the spot smaller to start. I want the cloth to have softer shading and highlights, and avoid the exaggerated highlights that the armor has. I started with a base coat of Bonewhite, and just like with all the other base coats, I thinned the paint and applied several layers for a smooth finish. I'm going to take a different approach for the shading and blending. I'll paint opaque shadows directly into the folds first, and then blend them later. I'm using Zandri dust, thinned slightly with water, and I'm painting it directly into the folds of the fabric. It might take a couple coats to get an even finish. Don't worry about blending at this stage. The goal with this layer is to focus on the shape of the shadows. Think of how the light is hitting the model and where those shadows should be. Next, it's time to blend the two colors together. I'm starting out by mixing the two colors on my palette. Thin the paint down with water and make sure there's very little on the brush. Apply some glazing right on the edge where the two colors meet. Work on one side at a time. Right now I'm working on the Bonewhite side. Apply one layer after another, slowly building up the color until it looks blended, and then work on the Zandri dust side. You can go back with glazes of your base coat and shade colors too, and touch up any areas that need it. Going back and forth between the different colors can be an effective way of blending. I want to deepen some of the shadows a little bit, so I'm mixing some black into the Zandri dust. I'm going to blend this one as I go, using layers of thin glazes. Paint the shade directly into the recesses and build up a couple layers until it looks right to you. If you want to soften an edge, you can quickly rinse off the brush, dry it on a paper towel, and use the damp brush to blend out the edge. I like to use a combination of these techniques. Some edges might look blended enough on their own, others might need some help by cleaning the brush. With the shading finished, it's time to highlight the raised edges of the folds. Because I want the fabric to look soft, I'm not going to use edge highlights just yet. I want the next highlight to be blended as well. I made a mix of equal parts Bonewhite and Offwhite, and thinned it down with water. Just like the shade I just did, I'm painting some thin glazes on the raised edges of the fabric, building up layers and focusing on the areas where I want the highlights to be the brightest. There should be very little paint on the brush, and it should dry almost as soon as it comes off the brush. Finally, I want to paint an edge highlight on the cloth using pure white. Thin the paint down to a glaze, just like the other highlight colors. I'm focusing mostly on the top edges of the folds, but I still want the line highlight to be diffused a little on the edges. Cloth is softer than armor after all, and I want the highlights to reflect that difference in surface quality. And here's the finished model, painted with all the techniques you've just seen to varying degrees. The more techniques you have in your toolbox, the more your style will develop. Painting will become an almost intuitive process, where you're using several techniques at the same time and not even thinking about it. I hope I've been able to break down and simplify these techniques for you in a way that's easy to follow and replicate on your own. I hope you give these techniques a shot and try them out for yourself. And if you do, I'd love to hear about your experience. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, happy painting.